Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. Leadership dynamics in Europe appear to be in disarray. French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz have emerged weakened from the recent European parliamentary elections, while Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk appear in a relatively stronger position. At the same time, jockeying over the top jobs at the EU institutions in Brussels continues, adding to the current jumble. Outside the European Union, the United Kingdom faces the prospect of a change to a Labour government following its upcoming elections, which could significantly reshape its role on the continent. And finally, the surrounding uncertainty of U.S. leadership following this November's elections is creating doubts about the future of leadership in the transatlantic alliance more broadly. To explore these various developments and their implications, we're very pleased to have with us Sophie Pedder and Steve Erlanger with us on the podcast today. Sophie and Steve, welcome.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
Thanks.
Brief bios. Sophie Pedder is the Paris bureau chief for The Economist, where she writes about French politics and economics. And Steve Erlanger is the chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times, with extensive experience in covering transatlantic relations and European affairs from various posts across the globe. Steve, I actually want to start with you because we're going to rewind the tapes a little bit. I thought we might start this conversation at the G7, where I know you were reporting out from. And you had a fantastic piece titled "Weakened Leaders of the West Gather in Italy to Discuss an Unruly World." An unruly world. And one of the early lines in that piece read, "Except for Ms. Meloni herself, every one of the leaders is arriving at the meeting beleaguered, embattled, or endangered, an ill-starred convergence that speaks to the political tremors rattling across the West."
That's so great.
It is so great. And I just want to start there and just hear your reflections of watching what unfolded at the G7. Kind of give us a little bit of context for this moment and where you see political leadership in the West at this juncture.
Well, I find it a little bit cyclical. We're in an electoral cycle, and that always makes everybody nervous. And voters increasingly get very sick of who's leading them much faster than they used to 20 and even 30 years ago. I don't know whether it's social media or what it is, but people seem to be angry all the time, and they seem to be quite sure of their own virtue and much less willing to accept that someone else might have a different point of view that's acceptable. And so what you saw in Bari was the Group of Seven, which is the biggest industrialized countries of the West, but without Russia, which we kicked out a while ago, without China, but understanding even these leaders, not only their own weakness, but their comparative gradual weakening compared to the rest of the world in terms of demography and economics. So there was also an effort to reach out to the so-called global South, however you define it. You had leaders from Brazil, from Argentina, from countries that aren't part of the G7, that want a better, bigger say in the world. And then you have countries inside Europe, maybe best represented by Meloni, the hostess herself, who think that their parties, their more right-wing parties, haven't gotten a fair shake either. So it just felt very kind of swampy, to be honest. And because everyone's kind of scared, frankly, and scared of Ukraine and a little scared of Russia and scared of the economy and scared of Donald Trump, in a way, it made it easier for Joe Biden and the Americans to dominate the conversations, particularly on Ukraine and on the Middle East, which divides everybody. But the communiques were very bland because the Americans insisted on it. So it is one of those weird moments where Rishi Sunak, who's about, by all accounts, to lose very badly, Emmanuel Macron, which we'll hear from Sophie, has, bet the house in a way that is quite, one could call it audacity, one could call it recklessness. We'll see which word Sophie chooses, and she'll have another one, I'm sure. And Olaf Scholz, who leads this weird coalition, which is paralyzed because his own Social Democratic Party is very unpopular, and the Greens are losing credibility also, and they're being held up really by this Free Democratic Party, which doesn't want to spend any money on anything. So holding it together is very, very difficult. They're all very unpopular, and the far-right party, and in this case, it really is a far-right party, Alternative for Germany, Alternative for Deutschland, did really well in these European elections. And with state elections coming in September in the former East Germany, everybody's really nervous about the AfD and what it means for conventional politics, because it pushes everybody to the right, especially the Christian Democrats, who are likely to win the next election.
So maybe, Sophie, we will go to that French piece. So certainly of all the leaders there, I feel like there's the most drama and intrigue around Macron and his decision to call these elections. So which of Steve's words would you go with? Is it audacity? Is it recklessness? Is it something else? I guess talk to us a little bit about his decision and really how you're seeing the state of French politics at this moment. I know you've got a fresh piece coming out. I just looked on your Twitter account and the cover story, your cover story, France's center cannot hold. So what is going on?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we are looking at the most crucial election in modern times in France. I mean, this is not just another parliamentary election. We are looking at an election that could rewrite all the rules about how to treat the hard right, the far right. We can maybe discuss what those terms mean. But in any case, we have never got anywhere close in any parliamentary election under the Fifth Republic, which Charles de Gaulle founded in 1958, to having a party of that sort possibly commanding a majority, and at any rate, in all likelihood, being the single biggest party in parliament. This is unprecedented. We're in uncharted territory. And the word I would use for Macron's decision, I think, would just be, it's a huge gamble, that the stakes were enormous, and he has really put his own legacy on the line in many respects. It's a decision that even today, I have so conversations with people in here about why he did it, and even today his own closest parliamentary colleagues, ministers, find it difficult to understand. It was really a solitary decision, as many of his decisions are, but this one was one that he clearly been thinking through in his own head for weeks, but shared with no one, almost no one. He told his prime minister about it in the hour before the voting results came through on the European elections on Sunday, June the 9th. And it has just left everybody in a sort of some state of, everybody in the centre, I should say, in a state of panic. People on the far right in a buoyant mood like you haven't seen them before. They smell victory. They feel absolutely on top of the world. Jordan Bardella, who is the 28-year-old candidate for Marine Le Pen's party to be prime minister if they get a majority, he doesn't even do any campaigning. It's quite interesting. I was looking at his agenda for the week, and he doesn't go out to markets. There are no set piece rallies. He just does TikTok videos and the odd appearance on TV, and that is all he needs to do. And it's, from his point of view, probably quite smart. He doesn't need to. So if you look at the dynamics in this election, they are all working against Macron. They are working for the far right, and I should mention a left-wing coalition which is made up with 4 parties, and against all the odds managed to get themselves together. It really is a sort of unholy alliance of moderate social democrats and hard left sort of ex-Trotskyists and others, other assorted anti-capitalists who have got their act together for an electoral alliance. And they are also polling in second place in the polls, well ahead of Macron's party. So we're looking at a completely different electoral landscape, which could bring the national rally, that's Marine Le Pen's party, into government.
I guess a question for both of you is, to what extent do you view this rising popularity surge in support for the far right in France, in Germany, and some other places as genuine support for these parties, their ideas, their actual policies? And to what degree is this more a referendum on sitting leaders, just discontent with the establishment, with the center? Is it a vote against the establishment, or is it really a move and a vote for the ideas and the policies that these other parties are advancing? How do you view this?
Shall I have a go at that?
Please do.
And we could maybe, Steve, I'm sure, could speak much better than I can for any other country. But I spent Tuesday in a small town in rural France to try and get a sense of this. And it's really interesting. I think that it is not necessarily a vote for these parties and their programs. What people were saying, and I was talking to people sitting in cafes, having beer, drinking coffee, people in the market, what people are saying is they just want change. They don't want Macron anymore. And it's an odd thing to say because he remains president. This isn't a presidential election. But what they want is something different. And what you have in France is the only party that really has never been tested, has never held national office, is Marine Le Pen's National Rally. And it seems to me, listening to people, they don't like this and that. They don't like the fact that energy prices, their bills has gone up, and of course none of us do. They don't like the fact that motor fuel, gas is more expensive in France. They don't like the fact that Macron reformed pensions in order to make them retire 2 years later. They don't like a lot of things in life. They also don't like immigration. They don't like crime. They don't like security. All of these things were raised by people I spoke to. But it was very difficult to find people who actually knew what the National Rally stood for in their program. And it was quite interesting. I spoke to one woman who said, well, she likes the guy who does TikTok videos. And that is how she put it. This is Jordan Bardella, who does these incredibly popular TikTok videos, that very, very short little clips that get over 1 million views often. And this seems to be part of what it's about. It's change. It's someone new, and it's someone they haven't had in power that they can't sort of reject. So that was very much the feeling I had from this day on the campaign trail.
Steve, I want to hear from you too, but there does seem to be this universality about what you just described. And I'm thinking of El Salvador and Bukele, and right, you have these new parties and leaders. They're new. They don't have any affiliation with past parties. They do the TikTok videos. They're able to circumvent media and other traditional channels. I mean, I don't know. It is really striking to me how you see the same dynamic in countries that are so different in terms of their history, cultural context, et cetera, et cetera. But so there does seem to be something about this desire for change and the way that these new leaders are able to make connections with voters. But anyway, Steve, I don't know, is it something similar in Germany, or would you describe it differently?
Well, it is very similar, and some of the issues are similar. I mean, the issues are economics, the issues are migration. These parties are against what they consider to be excessive migration. They're about identity. People feel like migration is changing their lives. It's against elites. I mean, Macron has always been regarded, because he is, as quite arrogant. He's still thought of as a banker somehow. And he's also, and I'd be curious to get into this with Sophie, but he's failed to create a party. So if you're going to have parliamentary elections and you don't have a real party, you're going to be in some difficulty. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. It was very personal. But in Germany, I mean, you could even argue the victory of the SPD of Olaf Scholz last time was kind of a surprise, because the CDU candidate Laschet was so awful. And the bigger parties in Germany have been losing ground regularly. It's very hard now in Germany to have a two-party ruling coalition. That's been true for a very long time. But this is a particularly weird set of three. So Scholz, who's also kind of a very distant, rather arrogant person himself, people don't like him. But again, in Germany, you also have this other thing going on, which is people really feel they're paying too much for energy and electricity. And part of it's because of the Ukraine war, part of it's cutting off Russian gas, part of it is environmental regulations, some imposed by Brussels, which are expensive. Lufthansa's just announced it's going to give a whacking increase on all its air tickets soon to deal with requirements for better jet fuel required by the EU. So there is this sense of resentment, a sense that life as people have known it is changing. Of course, it always changes, but it's changing in a bad way for many people. And if you look at, basically growth in Germany, it's been hurt by the Ukraine war. It's been hurt by China's problems. It's been hurt by the lack of immigration of technical people. I mean, Germany is having a real shortage of skilled people. So there's a lot of anger and a lot of sense of anxiety. And then coupled with the sense, which maybe the global south shares in a bigger way, which is that the old elites just don't care that much. And that no matter who you elect, because of a coalition, you're going to end up with something fuzzy anyway. And in Germany, you get a coalition that actually can't do anything at all. So it is a problem. And people are also, I should say, very concerned about security and very concerned about how much money they will have to spend now on their own security, let alone Ukraine. So all this kind of comes together with a deep sense of anxiety fed by social media and fed, as you said yourself, Andrea, by younger politicians who are much cleverer at reaching the parts others don't reach.
Well, thank you both. I just this is a wonderful, almost poetic descriptions that you all have provided, and I really appreciate it. And just let me ask, if you were sitting in the U.S. and you're not so familiar with European politics, and you're listening to this, you'd be tempted to say, "My gosh, it sounds like Trump and MAGA has infected Europe. It's become now a U.S. export, and this is terrible. Really, this is spreading across the globe, et cetera, et cetera." Because there's some echoes there. There's some sentiment there that y'all have just described that would ring home to people sitting here and go, "Gosh, that's like here in the U.S." Tell me how it's not like here in the U.S. Tell me how this is not MAGA. This is not Trump. This is European politics. It's been that way for a long time. It predates Trump. In fact, it was invented in Europe in some ways. So what would you say to an American who says, "My gosh, is this Trump happening in Europe, or is it not?" Steve?
Well, I would, I'm not sure that's entirely true, because Brexit, I think, was very important for Trump's election. I think it inspired people. I mean, Trump didn't expect to win the first election, to be sure, but his ability to, as a very rich person and a television star, to appeal to anti-elitist feelings on the part of many Americans while amusing them terribly, because he is a very good feral politician. I think a lot of Europeans have taken lessons from this, to be honest. Now, the politics are obviously different because you have coalition politics. I mean, Britain's first past the post, but and it's not always left and right, because in Britain, you're going to have the Labour Party, right? So it's not just that it's a move to the right. I think it is a very strong sense that the old system and the old parties have not been working. The promise of a better life has not been realized. I'm worried about my kids. I feel, rightly or wrongly, more crime in the streets. I see, particularly in Europe, after the big wave of migration, when Angela Merkel said, "Wir schaffen das," we can do this. Well, the Germans have done it pretty well, but it's changed the makeup of a certain kind of city. You have a lot of young male Muslim migrants who don't know European history. They don't know what Germany went through in World War II. They don't have the same feeling that we have to protect our ties to Israel, et cetera, et cetera. And you have just a more, I guess, angry and somehow politics is making it okay to be angry. And that's something I think Trump has done. He's broken so many barriers of decency and discretion that I think this has been infectious.
Interesting. No, I can certainly see that. Sophie, what do you think?
I was thinking about your point about how, is the French election, I'm thinking to myself, a reflection of what goes on in what I hear in the debates in the US election? And I think I would say there's certainly are echoes, and you see that in the way in which social media is used, in which echo chamber effects amplify certain themes and simplify certain themes. But I would say there's a very different political culture in France, nonetheless, and I would say it goes for the UK as well and other countries in Europe. And that is, there is still a seriousness about the politics and the debates. If you take Jordan Bardella, the guy I was talking about earlier with his TikTok videos, he also this week gave a press conference on Monday where I was, and he had to lay out and listen and answer questions very seriously about, what would be his budget deficit projections, what would be his policy towards energy, towards the European Union electricity market. And he tried his best to give very detailed and specific answers to those questions. And what I mean by that is that he is sort of buying into this political culture of seriousness nonetheless. He's trying to look respectable. The National Rally is trying their best not to sort of play that populist hand and to come across as an extremely sensible, serious party ready to govern. And so I suppose what I mean is that there are echoes, but there is still a different culture here, which, for better or worse, enables those politicians to tap into public sentiment in a slightly different way to the way it seems to work in the US at the moment.
I think Sophie's right about that. And I'm also very intrigued by it's been happening for the last maybe 5-7 years. But the debate is, if you take these parties like the National Assembly, are they safer inside a government where they have to deal with real issues and make compromises and actually rule? Or is it safer to try to keep them outside with the cordon sanitaire and let them say whatever the hell they want and promise whatever the hell they want to anyone? And you see it in Sweden, let's say, where the Sweden Democrats have been tamed a bit. You see it in Finland, where the true Finns have been tamed a bit. You're now seeing it in the Netherlands a bit, I think, where Geert Wilders is done really, really well, and will be a big voice in a new coalition government, which starts next week. He won't run it, but he will be complicit in whatever happens. So I'm just very curious, I'm always, to make a distinction between European Parliament elections and national elections is very important. People tend to vote not always the same way, but it may happen inevitably, whether we like it or not, but if the RN gets into a position of power, I'll be very curious to see whether they tame as they're talking now, or in fact, whether they suffer in terms of popularity down the road. That's Macron's bet, I guess, that I'm going to be president for 3 more years anyway. So let's see what happens, and maybe they'll screw it up.
I think you're right, Stephen. I mean, the one comparison that's often made in France is, of course, with Meloni's Italy, and the idea, the question that's raised in here is would the National Rally in power soften like Meloni has, and once she realizes that her promises made on the campaign trail collide with the reality of the European Union's functioning, and she has to make compromises, and she has to make concessions, and she has to stick by European Union rules, as on the whole broadly she has done. I think that where that comparison is going to really be tested in France is partly on domestic policy, but above all it's on foreign policy. And this is where we are facing, again, I keep using this phrase uncharted territory, because it just we haven't seen a period in modern France where you have a party of the far right in power with a president from the centre. I mean, we haven't seen a government of the far right at all. So we need to try and think through, and this is what we're doing in France at the moment. How is that actually going to work? Is it going to be, who is going to be, really representing France when it comes to policy towards the European Union? If you let's take an example, France's support for Ukrainian membership of the EU, or France's decision to be much more outspoken in terms of sending military support to Ukraine. Now, theoretically, under the Fifth Republic Constitution, that those are the domains that are the preserve of the president. So we would expect the president to be able to maintain his position as Macron has laid it out so far. The fact is, though, that the government, if it's the National Rally, will then be in charge of the finance ministry, in charge of the defense ministry. The Arms for Ukraine money, where does the money coming from? It's coming from the budget. Who runs the budget? It's the RN defense minister, or the finance minister. And that is where you see the potential immediately in an example like that, potential tension that could exist between the two different heads of the executive under this scenario. Now, we don't know yet that the RN is going to win a majority, and they have said that if they don't want to run the government, which is interesting in itself, as it suggests that they don't want to expose how difficult government is, or to be exposed to how difficult government is. But I think what we are looking at is a really new set of challenges for France as it tries to negotiate its way between potentially, the pressure from the far right to push France in certain directions, and the constitution and the president, on the other hand, who are going to be in a way a sort of bulwark against that, and try to and we will lies ahead to see if and when and how that plays itself out.
And of course, these will be big challenges for Brussels too, because there's a kind of complacency a bit in Brussels that says, well, money will tame them, right? That finances will tame them, that as it tamed Liz Truss. I mean, you can't just spend money endlessly without consequences. And so perhaps like Meloni, who's bent on many things that she supposedly cares about, to concentrate on migration, which is one of her great big issues. But thinking of what happened in Greece, in the end, money tamed populism. But I think people are being a bit complacent about this. I think the trend is much bigger now.
I think that's right. And also, you can say that government tames populism, or the grubby compromises that government imposes tames populism, or even markets tame populism. But the fact is, you've still done damage in the meantime, and that's what we've all got to face up to as well.
It's that damage I was thinking about, Sophie, when you were, and Steve too, when you were talking about once you get into governing, you're forced to make compromises, you're forced to do these other things. But I was thinking that was the feeling about Trump too. When Trump was elected, the same thoughts were he was going to go in there, there would be adults in the room, there would be safeguards, and he'll have to be tamed. But he didn't want to be tamed. He refused to be tamed. You had to go with the courts. You had to do all these things. And if he's reelected, he is coming in smarter, with absolutely dead set of not being told that he can't do something. A compromise and custom be damned. So are we seeing, not at this scale, but are we seeing that potential in France as well, where Le Pen could come in and say, listen, you kind of pointed to it a little bit about the commander in chief versus the role of the National Assembly in terms of defense and military types of things. Are we seeing a potential where you've got a RN saying, listen, we're not going to do what we've been doing in the government for the past number of years. We're not going to stick to tradition. This is what we're going to do. A, B, C, and D. Is that kind of deconstruction a potential there, or is that more of a Trump thing and it's not necessarily RN?
I think it's not necessarily. And I think the reason for that is you need to think ahead to the presidential election in 2027.
Right.
And that is when Macron cannot run again, because under the French constitution, you can't serve for more than 2 consecutive terms. So he has to stand down. And if you were Bardella, the 28-year-old who makes the TikTok videos, if you were him and you're thinking ahead to that, and you're Marine Le Pen, who is essentially the one who's made Bardella what he is, you want make sure that you have still got credibility intact to run in 2027 at a time when Macron can't beat you this time round. So I think that we're going to see different dynamics. It's very hard to see how it is going to play out. The RN has almost contrary views to Macron on almost every aspect of policy, whether it's policy towards NATO, towards Ukraine, towards the European Union. At one point, Marine Le Pen wanted to pull France out of NATO's integrated military command. That's what Charles de Gaulle did in 1966, but then France went back in and is now a fully committed member of NATO, and especially on the eastern flank of NATO with Russia, where France does a lot of operations there in terms of things like air policing and maintaining a military presence. So France is a very strong member of NATO at the moment, but now the RN has recently wrote a little bit on that. They're saying, well, we wouldn't pull France out of NATO's integrated military command while the war is still going on. So you can begin to hear this sort of language of compromise, of rowing back. I think, it depends if they are in government and you have Macron in the presidency with these two sort of conflicting positions. It's going to depend a lot on the sort of balance of force there, the way in which they decide, or Bardella decides to, and the National Rally decides to play this. Are they going to pick every battle? I doubt that. They will pick certain battles like immigration that they really care about. They'll have to drop some things, and it may be the things like support for Ukraine or NATO is one of the ones that they just decide not to make an issue of if they are in power.
Right.
And Jim, I must say, I can't really think of a European Trump. I mean, Trump to me is sui generis. I'm not sure you can have Trumpism without Trump, even in America, because of the kind of politician he is. But as Sophie's described, there are more restraints in Europe, partly because of coalition politics, right? And also because of a certain kind of decency, I would say.
Yeah, right.
That's, you get people like Salvini, you get loudmouths, but even people like Wilders, who's, very polite and doesn't scream and yell. He says terrifying things, but very politely. So it is a different culture, I think.
Just to zoom out a little bit, and kind of go back almost to the G7 question about what this all means for leadership in Europe. And Steve, with your story, I mean, you have this dynamic that we're talking about in several different capitals. At the same time that you've got the war in Ukraine, a resurgent Russia that's stepping up its hybrid attacks, that you've got a crisis, a war in the Middle East, all of the issues that they're navigating with China. I mean, we could go on and on about the kind of scope and significance of the challenges that European leaders are facing. So what does it mean on a kind of European level when you have these leaders who are so weakened domestically? So a Macron, obviously Sunak is, on his way out, but the coalition in Germany, et cetera. How do you think it's going to shape Europe's ability to get things done?
Well, it's harder, and we see this with the upcoming NATO summit. It's harder to get them to commit to longer term financial things and so on, because they're not sure how much longer they'll be in power and what's going to replace them. I think in general, though, and this may not be the usual thought, and I may be wrong, but I do think Ukraine has been a kind of wake-up call, a prise de conscience for Europe. I mean, it has suddenly realized that there are bigger dangers in the world than mixing brown glass and green glass, right? That the Russians are real and that Putin has changed. And they no longer have Ukraine as a sort of buffer zone between themselves, i.e. Poland, and Russia. So I think this has been actually very important. And you see it even in Macron's fairly late, but his come to Jesus moment on Ukraine is quite sincere. I think he really does see the threat, and he's going to try to continue to keep France helping Ukraine. So I do think it has pulled Europe together to some degree, but it has also made them, because they let their own militaries disappear, it's made them more dependent on America than anybody wanted, certainly than Macron ever wanted. And his arguments that Europe should do more for its own defense, it should take its own interests more seriously. He's been saying this for a long time, ever since he came into power, and he's completely right. It's just that very few people listened, to him. And now there is this issue with Trump possibly coming back to power, whether, as Macron wondered, whether Biden was the exception to a trend in America of less interest in Europe and less interest in the world and more attention to Asia and so on. So I was very struck. I was very struck by Mark Rutte, who's going to take over NATO in October at the Munich Security Conference. He basically stood up and said, "Stop whining about Trump." He said, "There are things we need to do for our own interests. We need to spend more money on the military. We need to build more ammunition. The Americans will do whatever they do and will dance with whoever is on the dance floor." And I think that is beginning to sink in. So I see some positive things also.
But Sophie, they'll take this to you. But you obviously, as Steve just said, Macron has had this come to Jesus moment, and he has been a big proponent of doing more for Ukraine, including this idea of the borrowing to finance some of the greater military aid. If he's weakened at home, what does that mean for his ability to lead within Europe on these issues? And I also am curious what you both think about what this means for our so-called Franco-German engine. If Scholz and Macron are both so weakened, where is the leadership and where is the energy and the momentum going to come from? Is it the Meloni and the Tusk? Is it shifting, or, I don't know, thoughts on those questions?
Well, on your first point, I mean, I think one of the things that Macron has argued for all the way through, and this is the question of Europe doing more for its own defense. The great sort of paradox of the moment is that this is something he has pushed and is now becoming received wisdom in Europe in a way that it wasn't when he first spoke about it. And he laid it out when we did our interview with him in April, a really long interview for our cover story then. He's incredibly eloquent and clear-sighted and clear. He thinks very clearly about what Europe needs to do, how Europe needs to get there, why it's in Europeans' interest. He links it all together with the European defense industry at the same time. And this is something that has now become, voiced, as Steve was saying, by people like Mark Rutte, but also, even in Germany, it's an accepted part of what where the conversation has to go. So, the great irony of this is that you have someone who has won that argument in Europe, when he's now put his own political credibility on the line with this election. So it is difficult for him. I mean, I have no doubt that Macron would say will not lose any of his energy and won't think for a moment he's going to be enfeebled, but he won't get the same look from his other leaders around the table when he sits down that he has done until now. And he is one of the longest serving leaders in Europe now. It's quite interesting. I mean, people think of him as this sort of young newcomer, but he's actually almost the sort of veteran around the table when European leaders sit down. So it is complicated for him and for Europe. On the point about French and the German relationship, I mean, I think something that's quite difficult for people to understand outside Europe is quite how fundamental that relationship is, regardless of who the political leaders are. It really is a relationship that is so dense at all levels. The high-ranking advisors, the civil servants, the even parliamentarians, they meet all the time. They are constantly talking to each other. Almost nothing gets done without that level of sort of coordination all the time, and that doesn't happen between the two governments of any other country. It really is very striking. Now, above that sits the sort of political dialogue, and that has been very complicated between Scholz and Macron, even before this election. So, nothing gets done without France and Germany agreeing. But if you have two leaders who find it difficult and both of whom are weakened, then that just means, for me, it's more of a question of sort of deadlock and a lack of momentum than it is for necessarily things going backwards or centers of gravity shifting, because actually it's very difficult to get anything done at all in Europe without those two countries behind it.
I agree with that, but they have not themselves been sufficient to push things through for years now, simply because Europe's gotten bigger, it's more diverse, and Central Europeans have a different view of what Europe ought to be. It's closer to actually the British view, but Britain's not there anymore. It left too soon. But, Macron has always gotten up people's noses, I would have to say. I mean, I think he's very smart and I enjoy listening to him. And as Sophie said, he's very clear. But he goes marching off in a direction and looks around, and there are not too many leaders behind him marching with him. And I think he has not done a very good job at building coalitions inside Europe. Sophie may disagree. And Scholz, that relationship is not a good one politically, partly because the two of them think they're the smartest people in the room. And both of them believe they won against conventional wisdom, which is also true. And a friend was sitting with Macron as he was on his way to meet Scholz and turned to this friend and said, "How do I reach him? What do I say to him?" And this has been an issue. Now they get on okay, and the two countries work together very, very well and very intimately. But even on something like Ukraine, France is a nuclear power. It has its own nuclear deterrent. The Germans keep arguing they don't understand. We don't have that. We depend on the Americans. You don't, right? I mean, there's all kinds of issues that, we're a federal state. We don't have a Republican king. There are all kinds of issues that get in the way. So I think the relationship is vital, but weaker than traditionally, and it's even weaker now. As I remember at Bari, it was a big deal on Twitter when Macron was greeting Meloni, and she gave him this wonderful side eye, like, "Oh Christ," And it's just partly it's about personality. It's partly about some of the things that he'd said. It's fine. But it's hard when you have the feeling in Europe that politics are shifting. I mean, they're not there yet, but power is shifting, and you have important leaders in important countries who simply are not as strong as they were a month ago.
So the last question is this. I know we're running short. Oh yes, Sophie, you were going to say something.
No, I just wanted to say that Steve's point about the nuclear deterrence is absolutely a crucial sort of example of a conversation that is going to be difficult to now have. Macron had launched this idea of there being a European dimension to the French nuclear deterrent. Now, That is something that has started some conversations and is of interest to some other countries in Europe. But this is exactly the sort of subject that it could be just incredibly difficult to make progress on if you have a weak president who doesn't look like he's going to be in control of the country in the way that he was, even though it's very clear to everybody that Macron will remain, the commander-in-chief of the French armed forces. He remains the one with his finger on the nuclear button. That goes without saying, but it's the sort of political authority problem that he may have to try and push conversations like that forward, which are nonetheless conversations that Europe needs to have.
I think
Absolutely.
It's a political authority issue. Like Sophie, your point was, they're not going to move backwards, but there's not a lot giving momentum and energy to move forward either. And I guess that's the thing that's so concerning, given kind of the scope and magnitude of the challenges that Europe faces. But Jim,
right.
you get the final question.
Well, the final question is this one is actually focused on Moscow and how does this look to if you're looking at it from the Kremlin, if you're Putin and you're watching all of this unfold that we've just been talking about, what's his take on all this? Does he rub his hands in glee? Does he feel nervous because he doesn't like this instability? Does he look at this as an opportunity for him to? What do you think Putin is saying as he watches this unfold in Europe?
Let me start as a former Moscow bureau chief who met Putin in '92 and has been watching him for quite a long time. I don't pretend to read into his head, right? I think that's a big mistake. And I do think his ambitions have gotten bigger. His outreach to the West originally was pretty sincere, but it just didn't last. And I do think, I've written this myself, that NATO's offer of membership to Ukraine and Georgia in 2008 without a timeline was a stupid thing to do. And Putin's been trying to shut the door ever since. But what he has done is he has turned this war at home and in the global South into what he thinks of as a defensive war against Western encroachment, against NATO's encroachment, against Western ideas, against gender equality, against LGBT, etc. He's made this partly a civilizational war. He's presented it this way. And I think any sign of, and of course, he's trying to foment divisions. I mean, Macron himself has talked about this. The Russians have been playing around with electoral politics in France, Germany, elsewhere. So I think division suits him very well. I mean, he's been trying to divide Europe from America for a very long time, and that will continue. Trump may help him, Trump may not, I don't know. And to create divisions inside Europe too. I just think, a West uncertain and divided suits not only his narrative, but his view of the world.
Right.
I would just add that from the perspective of France, he can only be happy about the situation, and there's a very good reason for that, and that's the links that Marine Le Pen's party has had to Russia. I mean, we shouldn't forget this. It was a Russian bank that gave her party an electoral loan. 9 million euros doesn't sound like a lot by American standards, but it is by French, and that is an amount of money has been repaid. She's very keen now not to sort of talk too much about those links. She's denounced the invasion of Ukraine this time round, but she nonetheless comes from a sort of political culture in that party that has got a lot of Russian sympathizers, that has people who participated in election monitoring, for example, in the referendum in Crimea. She has that sort of background, and it is therefore inevitable that Putin, sitting watching what's going on in France, can only be very happy about it.
Yeah, I mean, France really has been in the Kremlin crosshairs, right? For everything that Macron has said about potentially sending troops, increasing strategic ambiguity, all of the information operations that the French government has uncovered. The other thing I think about too is, France has also done quite a lot for Moldova, Armenia, and others to try to strengthen the resilience of countries on NATO's eastern flank. And so you wonder then if those efforts kind of fall by the wayside as well. So, again, Steve, you're exactly right.
I was just going to say, you're absolutely right on the sort of way in which Macron's policy, where he's taken an increasingly hawkish stance, that he's really started to speak out about Russia in a very strong language, and to want to support Ukraine, and has been putting a lot of effort into supporting into the NATO operation in Romania, as well as in the help for Moldova. But what you have, in a way, in France is the sort of, it encapsulates exactly those two positions, the one that stands up against Russia and the one that is instinctively sympathetic to Russia, and is encapsulated at this election, where you have the choice between a party that comes from that tradition of Russian sympathizers, and the potential for them to be in government with a president who is taking a stand against Russia, and who's been, as Steve mentioned earlier, the victim in his own campaigning of a massive leak of information from his campaign back in 2017, as well as all the disinformation campaigns, even the bed bugs. Remember the Paris bed bugs? That was an example where Russian disinformation. We all were astonished by that at the time, but it turns out that it was, a sort of Russian disinformation campaign. So you do have that battleground, about with hybrid warfare. Russian disinformation is going on right now in France, and that is one of the reasons that it really is one of the most crucial elections that France has ever had.
Well, we will be watching and covering what happens with that election in a future episode. But this has really been wonderful. Steve and Sophie, thank you so much for joining us. This was really a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, and
thank
you for what you're writing as well. It's excellent stuff, and I just want you to know you've got a big audience pool here in Washington to really cling on every word. So thank you for that.
Sophie,
thanks very much.
Fortitude. You'll get through
Bon
this.
courage.
Bon courage.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.